Thank you for joining us for episode 98 of Northstar's Private Equity Fast Pitch. Our host, Jeff Henningsen, president of Lockton Companies in Texas, will be speaking with Leon Brujis, a partner at Palladium Equity Partners, the oldest minority-owned private equity firm with over $3 billion of assets under management. Leon joined Palladium in 2007 and is responsible for originations and underwriting, as well as helping lead the firm's business services practice. Prior to joining Palladium, Leon worked in the mergers and acquisitions group at Lehman Brothers. Today they'll be discussing how to negotiate like a pro, Leon's unique and counterintuitive approach to negotiation, and what Leon recommends as the most critical business books to read. And now your host, the podfather of private equity, Jeff Henningsen.
Leon, I've been looking forward to this podcast recording. You and I have had a lot of discussions about our topic that we're going to focus on today. And like I said, before we turn the recording on, I think we could talk for 6 or 7 hours about this and probably just have a big time. Before we get into the meat of the main topic that we're going to jump to, I really would love for you to introduce yourself, tell the audience a little bit about your background and your firm.
Jeff, thank you for having me. It's an honor for me to be with the one and only podfather of private equity. In terms of where I'm from, my thick Brooklyn accent is from Argentina. That's where I grew up. I came to the US about 20 years ago, and I began my career in Wall Street as an investment banking analyst at Lehman Brothers. And I've been at Palladium for the last 15 years. I'm currently a partner there. Palladium is one of the oldest minority-owned funds in the US. We're currently managing $3 billion of assets, and our focus is investing in companies in the middle market where we see opportunities for transformation. I am one of 11 partners on the firm's management committee, and I split my time between our originations efforts and our business services practice. I am also heavily involved in a nonprofit organization called the New America Alliance, where our mission is to increase access to capital to women and minority-owned fund managers, which is something that I'm extremely passionate about.
So many places to dive in on this. The one that, just because I'm just posted a podcast with Deb Smith, who's a real estate investment banker. She was fortunate enough to leave Lehman about the same time you did in 2007. So you dodged a bullet on that, it seems like.
I was lucky, but to be honest with you, I have the best memories at Lehman, and it was a great place to start my career.
I think there's probably at least 10 plus of my podcast guests who spent some time at Lehman, a great firm. So I'm not going to go into a bunch of questions on your firm because we had Megan O'Grady, who runs your business development, on as a podcast guest not too long ago, and she did a phenomenal job of doing that. We're going to talk about negotiation and your strategies there. Can you give the audience a basis for this topic, and then we'll dive into some of the areas?
Absolutely. I think that generally people think about negotiations as having to do with big deals, big purchases, or the like. I would argue that negotiations happen every day, in every interaction, including with yourself. You negotiate all day from the time you wake up to the time you go to sleep. At work, you negotiate contract terms and conditions, hiring, managing, firing, defining deadlines and deliverables, seeking alignment with others about strategy, enlisting stakeholders, creating partnerships, dissolving them. You make offers, counter offers, agreements to settle. You say yes, you say no, and you stall for time. Then, when you go home, the negotiations continue over buying a new car, switching carpool days, or how much screen time the kids are allowed. The stakes can feel sky high at times. What medical advice to follow, how much to spend or save, how long your aging parents should live at home. From the major to the mundane, negotiating is the way we get things done. And at heart, it is linked to our ability to influence, which I think is an important predictor of professional and personal success.
Sometimes I think my negotiations are more difficult when I walk through the door at night than they've been all day long.
I would argue that those are the most difficult because at work, there's usually a hierarchy, but at home, that hierarchy is very fluid.
I don't know. The hierarchy is pretty clear when I walk in the door.
There you go.
Well, you shared with me before we kicked off that there's a central strategy or theme to how you negotiate. Can you talk to me about that?
Absolutely. I think I have a bit of a non-traditional style when it comes to this. But when we think about negotiation, we sometimes think of the traditional good cop, bad cop strategy, and that successful negotiations require getting to yes very quickly. But in my opinion, there is a great deal of sensitivity and emotional intelligence that goes when you are negotiations. If you look at traditional negotiation strategies and many disciplines such as economic theory, those disciplines and strategies rely on individuals behaving rationally. However, we must recognize that at heart, human beings are driven by emotions. We all strive to be rational in our behavior. However, it is impossible to fully separate our emotions from our actions. It's just something that we have to recognize that it cannot be done. That is where empathy comes in. The ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes, the person across the table, so to speak, is a heavily underrated skill. Putting yourself in someone else's shoes will be a tremendous asset and help you increase your influence. Research suggests that picking up on emotional cues can help your brain align with your counterparty. This is called neural resonance, which is when your brain mirrors the counterparty's emotions, helping you to better understand how they're feeling.
It's interesting you talk about mirroring and matching the person you're speaking with and having that ability to sit in their shoes. It's really funny as we've kind of gone through the tumultuous time that we've just gone through in the US. I remember back in my growing up days in elementary school in Omaha, Nebraska, the terminology back then was to imagine how it feels to walk in another person's moccasins, which in Nebraska was very much in the old days, long time ago, Indian territory. But that was our empathy statement that teachers taught us back then. That concept has not changed. In fact, when I was in early stages of my career, I used to practice mirroring in meetings and cross my legs to see if somebody would follow me or lean in to see if they would lean in. And it is phenomenal and fascinating how they don't realize what they're doing and how you can start to really have, like you said, beyond just your verbal discussion with somebody, a physical connection by how you move your body and how you engage with them.
Absolutely.
So, Leon, there's tons of content out there on this. And as I just said, people have been talking about this type of idea forever. Books, MBA courses, classes. What do you feel is unique or counterintuitive in your approach to negotiation?
Most people learn to negotiate on the job, and there's usually no formal training. And as we've discussed, there's multiple books on the subject, Getting to Yes, The Art of Negotiation, and The Psychology of Influence and Persuasion. In my opinion, many conventional approaches don't always work because they don't address this emotional component that you were just reflecting upon. For example, lots of books focus on forming alignment, but to me, something that is counterintuitive to the negotiation process is that getting to know is important. Let me explain. One of my favorite books on the subject is Never Split the Difference by Christian Voss. In the book, Christian Voss emphasizes the art of mastering getting to know. When you get others to say no, you give the counterparty an opportunity to get the sense of safety, control, and authority. And you want to trigger these feelings. The sooner you get to know, the sooner you're willing to see the options and opportunities that you were blind to previously. Focus the initial portion of the conversation on no-oriented questions. Say something like, is this the wrong time to talk to you about this? Or have you given up on this project? Conversely, when you push people to say yes from the get-go, they kind of feel trapped and eventually they will say no. Pushing people to say yes will put them on the defensive.
That's really interesting and aligns with some of the training that I've been leading with our sales folks. And we talk a lot about getting to know faster rather than allowing a prospective client to lead you along with a lot of yeses and maybes and yes, let's meet, let's have coffee, let's have lunch, asking hard questions to get them to say no. If they say no, then you're done and you stop wasting time. But also if they say no, but then you know what your next move should be. You've talked about some really good principles of negotiation here. What does this actually look like in the room? How can people embody this approach to negotiation?
I think when it comes to understanding behavior and reading those emotional cues that we talked about, Jeff, one thing is incredibly important is to mind your tone. We have all heard that 90% of communication is nonverbal. Maintaining a positive, easygoing tone will encourage your counterparty to open up. Using a calm and assertive tone selectively can create an aura of authority and trust. Listen with the intent to listen. Many of us listen with the intent to respond or don't even listen at all. A good way to show your counterparty that you're listening is by engaging what you mentioned earlier, which is this mirroring technique, which involves repeating the last few words that they say or focusing on the most critical keywords from their prior statement to pose a leading question. This way, the person across the table will feel that they have contributed.
You talk about tone, and it brought to my mind a comment that Dan Peasley from Jordan Companies gave me one time. It was about my podcast, and it was quite funny. He said, you know, Jeff, you've got this whole Delilah thing working. And I said, Delilah? And he said, yeah, you know, Sunny 99 or whatever the Sunny radio is. I go, you're comparing me to Delilah. And I much prefer a Charlie Rose type of voice, but clearly I must have a very calm, monotone, I don't know if it's boring or not voice, but Delilah is apparently who I sound like.
I think the guys in radio, the DJs, they have the tone that I'm talking about is the FM smooth jazz radio host.
That's it.
That's it.
That's it. I love it. And sometimes when I edit my podcast, I listen to myself. I wish I had a little bit more reflection, but apparently it's working. At the end of the day, my goal is to get my guests to talk like you're doing here.
I have a hard time listening to, like everyone else, listening to myself in the podcast.
This has been really great content, and I think people are going to learn a lot from it. We're going to dive back in a little bit, maybe towards the end, but want to ask a question that I ask all my guests, because I know you probably have some amazing advice, but what advice are you giving to young professionals that are wanting to go into the industry? I'm sure you have tons of young professionals that ping you and say, how can I get into private equity or investment banking? What do you have to share there?
Keeping with the topic of our discussion, I think that the ability to influence and persuade is an extremely important skill set that you want to develop early in your career. I always tell the folks that work with me that learning to manage upwards is an incredibly important skill that then in turn teaches you to manage downwards. And look, I think you should do 3 things early in your career. Listen, listen, and listen. Throughout your life, you will be told that you need to learn to listen. There's a quote from Simon Sinek that goes something like this. You should learn to be the last to speak. I see it in boardrooms and in people who consider themselves good leaders. They walk into a room and they launch into, here's a problem, here's what we need to do. The skill to hold your opinion to yourself until everyone has spoken does two things. Number one, it gives everyone else the feeling that they have been heard. It gives everyone the ability to feel that they have contributed. And two, you get the benefit of hearing what everybody else has to say before you render your opinion. In conversations, if you share your opinion too soon, you can undo it and it may expose yourselves. You've also lost the opportunity to hear out others and thereby learn about their opinions and giving them the gift of feeling heard to better understand the terrain overall. Resist the urge to push your opinion too early and listen. Don't listen for your cue to reply. Listen to learn. My advice would be to focus on these skills early. Remember that people reject what they are told and believe what they conclude.
I love that. And I want to make sure that our young listeners listen to what you just said, but influence does not mean talking. And I think a lot of times people misconstrue the word influence with persuading by talking. And I found, and as you just outlined, being able to listen and pause and maybe even not talk in that meeting, but come back with thoughts later can really show some strong intelligence as opposed to being the first to talk and talk too much.
Before we dive into the next topic, one thing that I like to tell the folks that I work with is that in private equity, we invest in companies and we work with a lot of management teams. And in many instances, we have controlling stakes and we can dictate the course that we want the company to take. But while we have the power to tell our management teams what to do, I always find that by generating consensus and having them buy into the course that we want to take, the execution of it becomes much better because they have ownership, because they've concluded themselves that this is the best course versus just doing what they're told, which you will not get, in my opinion, the same level of execution if you just jam it down their throat.
Well, it's interesting, and I want to stick on this for a minute. A lot of people speak, as you said, they're not listening to learn, they're listening to come up with their next thing they're going to say. And that next thing is typically based on the lens that they grew up with or the experiences that they've had in a increasingly diverse workforce, which your firm has been very focused on for many, many years. Everybody's coming with a very different lens and experiences, and you could very quickly and easily misjudge what your next statement should be. So pausing and really listening to learn and understand is even more critical, I would imagine, as we continue to become a melting pot and significantly more diverse than we have been.
I couldn't agree with you more. And at risk of opening a Pandora's box, one thing that I've spoken about on other podcasts is the effect of biases, right? And what I have said is that biases, everyone has them. If you live in the world, you have biases. And biases in many ways help shortcut the decision-making process. I think in business in particular, slowing things down, pausing and listening, what you just said, Jeff, makes you be more aware of biases that you might bring into a conversation, a discussion, or a negotiation. And there is no cure for biases, but you can have awareness of the confirmation bias or whatever other biases you might have. The only way I know how to do that is by slowing it down and trying to be measured in your conversation versus if you're going to do everything off the cuff and you're going to wing it, you're going to let those biases seep in.
Earlier, you mentioned in one of our segments about negotiating with yourself. Do you have anything to add on that? Because that's interesting, because I think a lot of people don't understand that a lot of times they're hurting their career, they're hurting their weight loss goals, whatever it is, by having these negotiations and talk tracks.
Yeah, I mean, I always say that discipline will set you free. To the extent that you can create a discipline that you can adhere to, and there's lots of books on the subject. Two that I want to mention is Atomic Habits and Make Your Bed, are great books that talk about our ability to create healthy habits. And I think that there's a quote in my board, and we'll talk about my board in a moment, that says, hustle beats talent when talent doesn't hustle. No matter how talented you are, if you're not able to wake up early to go to the gym, or don't put off that paper that is due next week, and instead of starting today, you start last minute, your procrastinating self is negotiating you and holding you back. Being able to master your emotions, negotiating with yourself to do what you know you need to do to accomplish your goals, that's the starting place as you want to become a student of negotiations, mastering yourself.
Unlike you, I think this is your 12th podcast as a guest. I was a guest on a podcast recently, and one of the questions was going to be, what are you passionate about as a leader? And, I have my own thoughts, but I asked a couple of people around me who work with me on a fairly regular basis. And one of them, who started with me when she was a college intern and now has worked with me for 11 years. And I asked her that question. She said, "Oh, that's easy." She said, "You push me to do things beyond what I think I can do, and you give me a safety net to fail without fear." And as you were talking, I was thinking about negotiation, because basically negotiation, a lot of times people think is a negative word, but I'm negotiating apparently in that scenario with her to push her to do things beyond what she thinks she can do. So negotiation can also be very much leading people to a win-win scenario.
100%. You remember your economics class, there's the Pareto optimal situation, which is when you generate a win-win outcome. And my view of negotiations is that those outcomes exist if you have that empathy that we talked about before, and you understand why the person in front of you is asking for what they're asking for, or is digging their heels. And I feel like if you are able to create that neural resonance that we spoke earlier, we can arrive to a point where we both understand each other and can walk the path to the optimal outcome together, which creates that win-win situation that you just spoke about.
You mentioned a quote a few minutes ago, and I've got to ask you that question. It's one of my favorite. Do you have any favorite quotes? What drives you? What gets you up in the morning and gets you going?
For those who know me and been to my office, they know I have a whiteboard with what I call PE lessons, some of which I mentioned to you during our podcast today. I have one that is my all-time favorite. It's a quote by Gandhi, which is, "Action expresses priorities." Those three words have helped me make sense of the world. When I am trying to understand why people act a certain way or do what they do, I try to focus on what they do versus what they say. And it enables me to decode their priorities and understand their emotions. And it is, to me, a constant reminder to go back to the beginning of what we talked about, which is to put yourself in someone else's shoes.
Give me an example of somebody's actions not aligning with their words.
Negotiating a credit agreement. And we arrived at an impasse where the other party basically said, what you're asking for is something that we cannot do, and this is just not working out. However, they were still at the table. There were still documents being exchanged and requests being asked. And that let me know that they were still interested in getting the deal done. So if I would have listened and taken literally what they said, we could have paused the negotiations. But that was their way of saying that they were having a hard time with whatever term I was asking for at that moment. But given that their body language was still one of, let's get this deal done, I realized that one, there was still some leverage despite hearing this is not working out, which is something that you generally don't want to hear during a negotiation. But also, it was a moment for me to apply tactical empathy and understand where they were coming from. To summarize, seeing that despite what they said about this not working out, they were still at the table, let me know that we were still negotiating.
I love that. That's a great example. And I think also culturally, that's going back to your listening, every culture has a different strategy on negotiation. And that can be very difficult in the work world when you're dealing with cross-border deals or folks in the US that have come from various parts of the world that grew up with a completely different environment of how they deal with conflict and negotiation.
Yeah, actually, not to plug my firm too much, but one of the things that I'm sure Megan spoke about was our focus on the Hispanic market in the US. And that is something Palladium has been doing for decades. And I think that what you just said is something that has been a tremendous asset for us, because whenever we've been in front of Hispanic entrepreneurs, there's an affinity and an immediate relationship that we can establish by sharing some of those cultural aspects that I think has made us win deals many times.
So that leads me to my last question. You're talking to an entrepreneur, they can sell or partner with thousands of various capital providers, private equity groups, and all kinds of different flavors of that type of partner. What are the lead behind words, the key things that you would want me to remember tonight as I'm deciding whether to partner with you or maybe another firm?
It's a great question. And I do think that this is something that in a very competitive environment is something that distinguishes. And the approach that I take when I meet management teams, entrepreneurs, or families that own businesses that we would potentially like to make an investment is I focus on what can I do for them. And I try to do a lot of research ahead of the meeting to try to find areas of connection. I apply some of the things that we talked about during this podcast. I listen with the intent to listen, understand what they are looking for, and try to be of value or provide value to them without expectation that they will be able to give value to me. And I think there's a sincerity that generates that actually can be magnetic at times and puts us in a good position after we leave the meeting. Not trying to, what can you do for me? Sell yourself to me type of attitude. I try not to do that. I also try to be helpful and try to establish a sincere connection. You have to understand that developing relationships sometimes is an instant connection, and sometimes you place a seed that may take 1 or 2 years to develop or even more. And I try to make these investments in relationships as I go about my business. And not all of them bear fruit, but private equity is a long-term business. And if you're in the long game, I think eventually this strategy will win.
Oh, that's awesome. And that's a very compelling strategy. I've really enjoyed this. It's something that I'm passionate about, and just all the negotiating strategies, people strategies, listening with the intent to listen. Those are all fantastic things. So I've really enjoyed this, Leon.
Jeff, thank you so much for having me. And I hope that this is the first of other collaborations.
Thank you for listening to Northstar's Private Equity Fast Pitch. For more information about Fast Pitch or our boutique heavy hitter events, you can visit us at enorthstar.com.